In early 2026, Russian helicopters are still flying, but not the way they were meant to. They take wider routes, they commit later, they pull away sooner than Doctrine ever intended. That hesitation isn't the result of lost aircraft or exhausted pilots. Russia still has helicopters, and it still has crews willing to fly them. What changed is something far harder to repair than hardware. Confidence collapsed years ago, and it never fully came back. Low altitude used to be safety, now it's exposure. Hovering used to be control, now it's a gamble. Every approach forces a calculation that Russian crews didn't used to make. Not about success, but about survival. What broke that rhythm didn't come from NATO jets, and it didn't come from sanctions or economic pressure. It came from a British missile that was never supposed to reshape an entire domain of the war. Once Ukraine began using Starstreak the way it did, Russian helicopters stopped behaving like dominant tools of the battlefield and started behaving like liabilities that had to be managed carefully. And by 2026, Russia is still flying under the shadow of that change. At the beginning of the war, Russian helicopter doctrine was built around certainty. Attack helicopters were expected to operate close to the front, exploiting speed and low altitude to stay difficult to track while delivering firepower exactly where it was needed. K-52s and Mi-28s weren't just support assets, they were meant to shape the tempo of ground fighting by appearing quickly, striking decisively, and disappearing before defenders could react. For a time, that logic worked, but Ukraine didn't respond by trying to beat Russia in the air. It didn't chase traditional air superiority, and it didn't attempt to mirror Russian aviation tactics. Instead, it attacked the assumption that the airspace itself was predictable. That shift became unavoidable the moment Starstreak entered the battlefield. The change wasn't gradual. Russian pilots didn't get months to adapt. One day, familiar tactics still felt safe. The next, helicopters were being hit in ways that didn't match any of the warning cues crews were trained to recognize. Missile warning systems didn't behave as expected. Countermeasures that normally bought time suddenly didn't. Engagements moved too fast for intuition to keep up. By the time pilots realized something was wrong, the engagement was already over. Starstreak didn't act like the missiles Russian crews had trained against. It didn't chase heat in the traditional sense, and it didn't give the long, readable approach profiles pilots were used to reacting to. Once fired, it arrived with speed and precision that left almost no margin for hesitation. That wasn't just a tactical problem, it was a doctrinal one. Starstreak didn't become feared because of theory or technical diagrams. It became feared because of what was captured on camera. Early in the war, footage circulated showing a Russian attack helicopter struck in midair. The impact didn't look like older shootdowns, where aircraft might stagger, trail smoke, or limp away before crashing. This engagement was different. The missile's penetrators hit almost simultaneously, tearing through critical systems in an instant. There was no drawn-out failure sequence, no opportunity for recovery. The helicopter was simply removed from the fight. That moment mattered far beyond the single loss. Inside Russian command structures, it forced a hard realization. This wasn't a fluke, and it wasn't a lucky intercept. It was evidence that low-altitude survivability, the foundation of Russian helicopter doctrine, could no longer be taken for granted. Once that belief collapsed, everything built on top of it began to wobble. Pilots could still fly, commanders could still assign missions, but the confidence that made those missions decisive was gone. And doctrine without confidence is just paperwork. What made Starstreak so difficult to counter wasn't just its performance, it was the dilemma it imposed. Flying lower increased exposure. Flying higher reduced effectiveness. Pulling helicopters back preserved aircraft but weakened ground operations. Pushing them forward preserved pressure but increased losses. There was no clean adjustment that restored the old balance. Starstreak's speed left little room for last-second reactions, and its resistance to familiar countermeasures stripped away the routines pilots relied on under stress. The missile didn't need to dominate the sky everywhere. It only needed to exist as a credible possibility. That possibility changed behavior. Pilots began committing more cautiously. Attack runs shortened, engagement windows narrowed. Missions that once felt routine required additional coordination, additional reconnaissance, and additional hesitation. By 2026, Russian helicopters are still active, but they operate inside constraints that didn't exist before. Their movements are more predictable, their presence less persistent, and their psychological impact far weaker than planned. That loss doesn't show up neatly in equipment counts or sortie numbers. It shows up in how ground units behave when air support is no longer guaranteed. What Starstreak really damaged wasn't the helicopter, it was the pilot's certainty. Russian attack helicopter doctrine was built around confidence, the belief that if something went wrong, the pilot would know. A warning tone, a heat spike, a cue that told the crew it was time to flare, brake, or dive away. Starstreak removed that comfort. Pilots didn't feel hunted, they felt watched. Approach runs that used to feel routine started carrying doubt, the kind that creeps in just before commitment, the kind that forces a second look at the terrain, a longer scan of the horizon, a fraction of a second where the trigger finger hesitates. That hesitation is everything, because attack helicopters don't survive by armor alone. They survive by rhythm, pop up, fire, disappear, timing that leaves no space for the defender to react. Once that rhythm breaks, the helicopter stops being a predator and starts behaving like a target trying not to be noticed. Starstreak didn't need to fire often to do this. It only needed to exist. Pilots began flying as if every approach might already be compromised. Flares stopped feeling like insurance. Countermeasures became rituals rather than solutions. The cockpit changed from a place of execution into a place of calculation, and calculation slows violence down. The most dangerous effect wasn't fear in a single cockpit, it was how that fear spread. One crew aborts a run early, another hears about it. Briefings change tone. Flight leaders start encouraging caution without saying why. Over time, the entire squadron flies differently. Not because of orders, but because of shared experience. No memo is issued, no doctrine is rewritten, but behavior shifts anyway. And once that happens, helicopters don't stop flying, they just stop dominating. Starstreak's real impact wasn't limited to helicopters. Once air support became uncertain, everything beneath it slowed down. Armored units hesitated longer before advancing. Infantry movements stretched out. Reconnaissance gaps widened as fewer helicopters were willing to loiter near contested areas. In a war already saturated with drones, helicopters were supposed to restore speed and initiative. Instead, they became another variable commanders had to account for cautiously. By the time Stormer vehicles equipped with Starstreak were operating more visibly, the message was already understood. This wasn't about isolated shootdowns, it was about denial. Starstreak didn't need to be everywhere. It didn't need to fire constantly. Its value came from being possible, from forcing Russian planners to assume risk even when no missile was visible. That kind of pressure is corrosive. It erodes confidence slowly, and once it does, restoring it becomes far harder than replacing lost equipment. If Starstreak had exposed a short-term weakness, Russia would have solved it by now. It hasn't, because the problem isn't the missile itself, it's the environment it revealed. Fixing that requires rewriting how airspace is used under constant surveillance and constant threat, a challenge modern wars punish relentlessly. Ukraine didn't take control of the sky. It denied comfort within it. Starstreak played a quiet but decisive role in that shift by proving that helicopters could no longer assume safety based on speed, altitude, or experience. Every sortie now carries the memory of what happens when assumptions fail. Russian helicopters still fly, they still strike, but they no longer dominate the way they were designed to. And once an entire category of aircraft is forced into defensive behavior, the strategic damage is already done. Starstreak was never designed to change a war. It was designed to destroy aircraft. But wars don't change because of intent. They change when one side adapts slower than fear spreads. By the time Russia realized its helicopter playbook no longer worked, the battlefield had already moved on. The cost wasn't just lost airframes, it was lost initiative, lost tempo, lost confidence in a tool that was meant to dominate. In modern warfare, fear doesn't arrive with alarms or headlines. It settles quietly into decision-making, shaping behavior long before anyone admits it's there. And once fear enters the cockpit, it never fully leaves. That's Starstreak's real legacy. Not a headline, not a single shootdown, but an airspace Russia still doesn't completely control, even in 2026.